And thank you all very much for inviting me here. It's an incredible hall. I think I'm not intimidated, but I'm overjoyed to be speaking in such a beautiful space. And to an audience that has been involved with, I guess I don't need this one, so I'll move that out of my way. Quite an impressive series of lectures on the issue of patronage that's been going on since January. I'm just honored to be in the same setup with Amy McNair and your own Jay Shu and Alfreda Merck and Woody Woodward and Mimi Yang Praksawan and Ankeny Weitz, Jake Dalton and Dora Ching, and your next speaker is Pat Berger, the inimitable Pat Berger. So it's wonderful to be able to address an issue that, as Peter said, is dear to my heart. This is a project that I'm working towards, and next year we'll be able to I hope, carry out in a more quantitative way than I'm able to do today. But the same goals are there. And what we're going to talk about today is in conformity with the topic of the series, which is patronage and the impact of donors, how they can affect art. But it is really to put the focus on donor figures or donor portraits, such as the one that you see. This is a very unusual one because it's a whole sculpture that is the donor. Usually the donors are very small, as we'll see, and are shown in a humble way, as this one is, with his hands together in what's called Anjali Mudra, kneeling in front, and we should imagine that this one would be kneeling in front of a large sculpture that is the one that he and his family had produced. And so normally we don't see as much detail front and back as we do here, but once in a while we do. So the focus today is on that aspect, and I'm not going to try to introduce issues of style. I'm not going to do an introduction to the religions that we'll be speaking about, including Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to deal with issues of iconography or themes, nor with techniques or the general, I guess you could say, political ramifications of the area that we'll be focusing. Just mainly looking at donors. And these are some of the issues that we might get to. We probably won't get to all of them thoroughly, but in the process of looking at specific cases that are in the Asian Art Museum's collection, I hope, gradually will get a sense of what we can learn about the motivations of the donors. And the obvious one, and the one that is encapsulated in the title, is making merit. So, well, why do we want to make merit? Brownie points for the Lord. There are religious motivations for making this, and this is the one that we most often think about. But there are also social ramifications and rewards, as you can imagine, for donating objects to public temples or private temples, that there is a kind of prestige factor. So we have to consider both the social and the religious motivations. We may have the opportunity to think about, can we call these portraits when in some cases we know their names? So is that sufficient to call them portraits, or are they donor effigies? There are other potential ways that we can refer to them. I think they're portraits in a simple definition. They might not be exact in verisimilitude. They might not have exact resemblance between them, but the thing is that we'd never know anyway. So why not call them portraits? Because they're specific people, and they are, you could almost call them self-portraits, because they're paying for their figure to be included in the overall sculpture, or rarely painting. And we can also hope to gain some insight into the history of Eastern India during the time that we're covering, between the 9th and the 13th century. And in particular, I'm very interested in the roles of women as donors. Women in this period have been often declared to have not been so involved in religious activities anymore. They've been supposedly confined to the home. And so here's an opportunity for us to test this general received wisdom. Are they shown at the bottom of sculptures? And so do they, in a sense, have a more public role than they're being credited with? And then the question is, or the assumption behind the question, why have the donor images been neglected? The assumption is that they have been neglected. I think they have. And for good reasons. They're often very small. They're often sort of at the sides of the bottom of the pedestal of a figural sculpture. And they have been dismissed as being idealized, as not being portraits, and so of no interest. It has been assumed that these figures at the bottom of sculptures are just added by the sculptors willy-nilly, just as part of the vocabulary, to show that the deities that are on the main part of the sculpture are being offered reverence. But I think that there are some interesting refutations of that argument because of the fact of many of them, by no means a majority, but many of them have inscriptions. And those inscriptions actually name the donors. They say, this is a gift of so-and-so. And, well, that could just be added too. That could just be sort of random, in the West, we tend to trust inscriptions and not images. So maybe we accept the inscription, because why else would they write that? But then we think, oh, but the image is just random. But in every case that I've been able to find, we can tell from a Sanskrit inscription the gender of the donor, because of the way that the nouns are given a gender. So we know when it's a female name, and sure enough, whenever there's a female name and a donor figure, it's a female. So that tells us that they're probably not random. And then every time when it says that the donor was a monk or a nun, sure enough, there's a monk or a nun at the bottom. So I think we can say that the donor figures are indeed meant to represent the actual donors. Not necessarily how they looked in detail, but still that they do represent actual people. And so that's interesting. So when we look at sculpture of deities, of the Buddha or of Shiva, these are not in the material world that we live in. They're not representations of people or things that we see, but those donor portraits actually were. They were contemporary to the artist, and tell us something about social life, I think, that needs to be not overlooked in the way that they have been so far. And then the question that I can't really answer today, but check back with me after 15 months in India when I go through this process of trying to document. I've already found about 500 examples in Eastern India, not counting Bangladesh, of sculptures from this time period of the 9th through the 11th century, or the 13th century, of donor figures, and I know that there must be more out there. let's compare not only the gender, what were the deities that women tended to donate images for? That would be interesting. But across the sectarian lines of what do women, for instance, tend to promote within Buddhism? What do they tend to promote within Jainism and with Hinduism? So these are the issues that will come up today in today's talk. But the main focus is to use some empirical data, if you will, that comes from the Asian Art Museum's own collection. Many of the objects that are out today in the very impressive collection of things that are on display, as well as a few that are not yet on display, but maybe switched out. And all of them come from this area that is, in simple terms, we can call it Eastern India. Of course, it's problematic. India was never a single country, as you know, until the British made it one. But there were these interacting cultures, and they sort of shifted at times control of these areas. But there were sort of cultural areas, and one of them is Bihar, where the Buddha was born and believed to have lived, and what is now West Bengal and Bangladesh. So for simple terms, we can call it Bengal. And then to the south of that is Orissa, or now it's called Odisha. They've had a name change. Nobody got married, but they nonetheless changed their names to Odisha to reflect a more indigenous pronunciation. So to simply call it Eastern India is fine. And the political parameters, we use the Pala dynasty as a convenient way to refer to this area and this period, because between let's say the 8th and 9th century until about the 12th, they controlled much, but not always all, of Bihar and Bengal, and then at times controlled parts of northern Odisha as well. And then they were succeeded by one of their own feudatories, the Sena, and the Sena was based mainly in Bengal, but they too took over many of the territories of their predecessors, the Palas. So we'll just call it Eastern India under the Pala Sena period, and think of it between the 9th and the 13th century. And they had a number of shared characteristics, but also distinctions between these three areas of the Bihar, Bengal, and Odisha. So let's start with our empirical examination of donor figures in examples from the Asian Art Museum here. And this, I'm sure you all know, it's one of the works that is set in between the Gandhara room and the Pala room in the galleries upstairs. And this fabulous standing Buddha and here's a case where we know exactly where at least it was found. It's a rare instance where we know the immediate provenance to an extent. Datable to the 7th century, so it's a little bit before the Pala period, but it is irresistible as a starting place. And it was found, we know the date when it was found, in 1861, when they were the British were building a railway in northern India, in Bihar, and this railway engineer, E.B. Harris, they were digging a mound of bricks in order to do ballast to create the tracks on top of a really solid kind of mound, and he found a metal foot. And wow, what's going on here? And they dug deeper, and they discovered a 2-meter metal, the largest Pala metalwork that is known today. It's now in the Birmingham Museum. And so this photograph was taken, and the Asian Art Museum's stone sculpture is right there, right? It's comparatively, it's good sized, but compared to this bronze image, it's quite small. And interestingly, the local people heard about it. Of course, the workers were actually local Bihari villagers, and they told everybody about it. And within about a week, some 10,000 local people had come to offer reverence to this, kissing it, thinking of it as a divine manifestation. And that tells us something right away. These things that we look at as sculptures, or as we're looking at it today as a source for socio-cultural, political information, are seen very differently, and were made for very different purposes originally. So we have to keep that in mind. We're looking at it not the way that the people who made it are looking at it. I'm not saying that both are not valid, but at any rate, they saw this as a manifestation of the deity that had been hidden and sort of self-revealed through the acts of the British, and they found it very impressive. They wanted to keep it and move it to their village temple, where many Hindu temples today still have Buddhist images in them. It's not a divisive sort of thing between the Hindus and the Buddhists. But the British, with their authority of history, told them, "Oh no, this is not Hindu. You don't need it. We're not giving it to you." And the Lord Mayor of Birmingham in England heard about this, because it was big news that they had discovered this, and he sent £200 to have it shipped to Birmingham, because they were just starting a new museum. And he thought, oh, wouldn't this be a magnificent thing to have in the museum? And sure enough, it is still in the Birmingham Museum, and it's still one of the most popular, one of the most powerful images today in the Birmingham Museum, and they keep publishing about it. At the same time, they found the Asian Art Museum's work, and I don't know how Avery Brundage got it, or what were the means by which it came here, but that's an interesting question, I think, and something that I think we'd all like to know more about. On the back is amazing, and the way that Forrest McGill, who's obviously the Asian curator here, has positioned it. You can see the back, which is so great. Many of the objects were made with inscriptions or other kinds of things on the back. Not all of them, but in this case, there is a stupa on the back. And a stupa is a reliquary. This is a representation of an actual architectural reliquary where the Buddha's physical relics, speech relics, and in a sense mind relics would have been inserted. And so a representation of that is itself a reminder that these are religious objects. And the inscription that you see below it's barely legible here, is what is often termed the so-called Buddhist creed, I guess in relationship to a Nicene Creed or something. It's a short statement that is considered to be a consecratory verse. So it is in essence the encapsulation of the Buddha's enlightenment. So that ineffable thing is itself considered to be a relic by Buddhists. So there are physical relics, the bones after the Buddha was cremated, little bits of ash. There are touch relics, the cloth that he and his followers, other enlightened people, touched. That would be a touch relic. And there are also speech relics. And that's what this is. This is a relic of his speech. So it says, all phenomena arise from causes. In other words, there's not individual things that are eternal, that have a soul, but things come together. They have a cause. And the things that are eternal have no cause. They just always are. But all things, all phenomena arise from causes, and the Tathagata, which means the Buddha, has explained these causes, and their cessation has also been proclaimed. In other words, all things are temporarily come together, but they also eventually fall apart, and they don't. And then things are rebuilt, but there's no essence to things. And so this is the essence of his teaching, and so is considered a relic. So when we see it on the back, that means that the Buddha is in that sculpture. That sculpture is the Buddha. It's not just a representation of him. And that's why people would come and kiss it, right? Because they considered consecrated objects to be no different from the Buddha himself. Of course, they recognized the difference. If there was a statue of the Buddha that was consecrated and the Buddha, they could distinguish between the two, but they would prefer the real Buddha. But nevertheless, this was not a lesser thing. So it's a privilege, in a way, to see these things. Now, on the lower, on the Buddha's proper lower right is a very small image of a kneeling, and it's tempting to assume that this is a donor. And I want to say a note of caution here. We can't always tell. And my first inclination would be to be very cautious about this one because the donor has a halo. And a halo would suggest either that they're saintly themselves, or that they're dead, and that this could be something that was dedicated on their behalf. That the merit of making this was dedicated towards this person, so that he might be reborn in favorable circumstances, which would allow him to be enlightened soon too. Nevertheless, there's an inscription on it which says that this person is offering this religious gift for attaining superior knowledge. Just means, enlightenment by oblations, things that are offered. At the new and full moon, auspicious moments, for the ancestors and for all beings. So he's not just taking it for himself, he's offering whatever merit is generated for all beings here. And so that seems to suggest that it is a depiction of the donor figure. And now, if we look at him in detail, he's sort of interesting. Now, let me go back here before we look at that. He's got long hair. And monks don't usually have long hair, but he has a monk's robe on. And you can see that by the line of the garment that leaves his right shoulder uncovered. And by saying illustrious Nikuda, it's suggesting that it's that it is a monk figure. Now, there's another one that was discovered at the same time in the same place, a fragment, also in Sultanganj with the large metalwork image that has it's just a fragment, but it is a fragment of the donor figure. And it is something that is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the inscription reads in part, this is the pious gift of the Buddhist monk, and the rest of the name is broken off. You notice how similar it is. And at this time, there were, and moving forward, there are many gifts given by monks and nuns. Fewer by nuns so far, but some. And monks are not exclusive. They're not uncommon. Now, this is a question of what kind of status do we have here? What kind of a monk is this? Because monks take what we call tonsure, right? They shave their heads, And so if we look at other images from around this time or a little bit later, here's an example of another nimbated donor figure who's holding lotuses and a incense burner as if to perform the ritual of offerings or worship, or perhaps um, the installation of the objects, or what it's called pratishta. And installation means consecration. So you perform a ceremony that says, okay, before that this was just a hunk of stone. Now the deity is inside it, or part of it. But he is a shaven monk, right? He's got short hair, but he has the same kind of robe that we have here. So it's a little bit of a question: what kind of a person do we have here? There's a wonderful 8th century altar piece, if you will, from Lakma that has another donor figure in the front of it. Who's in the same position and also has long hair and also has one shoulder uncovered. So it may be that actually, and here's another one from the same date, and probably from the same region, now in the Baroda Museum, who again has a monk with a robe but long hair. It suggests that by paying attention to the donor figures, we might be uncovering a indeterminate status that was actually lived at the time that is not recorded in normative texts, in texts which tell what you should do, and if you're going to be a monk, you should be a full monk with full tonsure and always do this, that, and the other thing. Whereas in fact, there may have been kind of indeterminate or intermediate, rather, states where they were kind of monks. They were more monks than lay people, but they weren't, or perhaps they were temporary monks. As they do in Thailand and other places today, they would go to the monastery for a certain period of time, and then the donor figures, the study of these, can lead us, I think, to a more nuanced understanding of some social categories at the time. Now, moving to another image in the collection, we have the Prajna Paramita, the perfection of wisdom. She's the embodiment of the wisdom texts which she carries on lotuses at her shoulders. This is the shape of Indian Poti books, where there were stacks of loose leaf pages that were stacked, and then there was a wooden cover on top and the bottom, and they were tied up. You see these angular strokes. That's meant to represent the tying up of these stack of leaves. And she is the personification of the notion of Buddhist wisdom, and is on display at the moment, and has the consecration verse that we talked about in the other one in an abbreviated form around the nimbus. You can see some writing here. And here. So she too was considered to be consecrated, and they didn't, in metalwork images, sometimes they insert objects in, including pieces of paper that write out that consecratory verse, or other kinds of actual relics. But in stone, often that suffices. The writing of the inscription suffices for the consecration. But at the bottom are what appear to be, and Forrest and I looked at it closely yesterday, and we decided that we can see 3 donor figures at the bottom. We're not going to derive too much information from this, except that there's a female figure here, and what may be a male or female figure here, I can't tell, but a smaller figure between them. As if this is a male, it's not uncommon, as we'll see, to find that there are actual families involved in making donations, and that they are also depicted, a mother and a father and a child. And so this may represent that type. So that's kind of interesting, that a wisdom goddess, Buddhist goddess, Prajnaparamita, would be the donors of that would be a family working together. Now, another object from a private collection in Zurich that comes from the same area, maybe about the same time. You can see some of the details of the way that the nimbus is edged, have some relation. This too has an inscription, and it says, and notice that this is a female deity, Tara, as the other one was, a female deity. This has an inscription that reads, this is the meritorious gift of Umaduka, the wife of Edaka. So sometimes the wives are clearly mentioned, or a woman is clearly mentioned as the principal donor, but she identifies herself as Mrs. Edaka. Now, I don't think this needs to be misinterpreted as sometimes it has been, as being not really a full actor in her own right, because she is the donor, not the husband. It's the inscription on the bottom. It's not clear exactly in this case who was the principal donor, but I have a feeling that since Purva is a common female name, that she too was a donor. And then there's another one, also from the close to the same period, that has another inscription offered by Umaduka. That I don't know if that's the same woman or not. She's got the same name, but she's got a different husband. That happens, I heard. So anyway, moving on to the next one. We have here one of the bodhisattvas, one of the great, in this case, compassion deities of Buddhism, who stalls their ultimate enlightenment and nirvana in order to stick around and help people in the three worlds of heaven, earth, and the underworld. And it comes from the same period. It's also on display now, and it shows this compassion in action in the bodhisattva's lower proper right, where this is a hell being known as Suchimukha, or the needle-faced one, who has a very, very tiny little snout of a mouth that can never get enough water to assuage his very big, thirsty belly. I'm a little thirsty myself. Behind him, behind Suchimukha, who's waiting for the amrit, the nectar, to drip off Avalokiteshvara's hand. He's got his outstretched palm in the gesture of gift giving, and he's assuaging the hell beings through his compassion. You see behind him is again the consecration verse. And then on the other side are the donors. And the donors are, in this case, two monks or nuns. It's pretty hard to tell the difference in some cases. They do have, especially the first one, if you go up and look at it, they have a kind of wavy, rolling chest. And I don't know if that's meant to suggest breasts or not. But they're, again, offering, one of them is at the foot of the lotus, and the other one is offering a lotus behind the first one, and then there's a lay person behind them. So groups of people would come together to pool their resources and then make donations. And that seems like a natural thing to happen. Now, they aren't identified by inscription, as is the case with most of these. But some are. And then here's one of your really really handsome works that's featured in the galleries upstairs. The Buddha triumphing over Mara. Mara is illusion. So with his hand down, he is calling the earth to witness that he has earned the right to become enlightened because of lifetime after lifetime of self-sacrifice. And he has he also has a consecration verse inscribed on the head nimbus. Again, as is familiar, there's one very much like it in LACMA, in Los Angeles County Museum of Art, that maybe came from the same place in the same time. And then a kneeling figure of a monk who's identified as a sort of senior monk, or not a young one, but a learned one. His name is Prajnaprabha, and he is shown kneeling in the standard gesture. Now, his hair is clearly of the shortened variety, but the face has been defaced. And sometimes this happened early on, and sometimes it happened during periods of iconoclasm in India. So it's not known when this damage, but I think we can say pretty persuasively that it's intentional defacement and not accidental damage, though accidental damage sometimes can also be can happen because of intentionally pushing things over. But this work too is made by a monk, and a monk of a particular type, one that seems to be fully ordained. And this astounding piece in wonderful condition seems to show the Buddha in or memorialize certain miraculous episodes in the Buddha's life. And there are little tiny icons underneath each of the Buddhas. If you look very, very closely, you'll be able to see that there's an elephant right by the one here. There's a little tiny elephant, and there's the earth goddess who's responding to the Buddha's call for the earth to come to witness, and there's a little monkey offering a gift of honey, and that happened just before the Buddha decided, I think this is it. I'm soon going to go into nirvana and pass away. And he made that decision at the time when the monkey gave him the bowl of honey. He accepted it. And then this one. Now, hey, is that our donor? Is that our donor figure? Well, this is where we have to be a little cautious, because the donor figure is in the same positions as we're accustomed to, kneeling and making the Anjali Mudra. But actually, this episode of the Buddha's life often, not always, but often features a nun, and in stories that circulated from about the 5th century onward and were recorded by Chinese pilgrims, it was believed that when the Buddha went up to Triastrimsa heaven, the highest, the heaven of 33, in order to preach to his mother, who had passed away a week after he was born. And when he came back down, after spending some weeks up there, he was supposedly greeted by a nun who welcomed him. And there's some miraculous stories that occur around this about how she got to the front of the pack of people that were waiting for him. But nevertheless, she is a nun who is believed to have lived at the same time as the Buddha and actually saw him. So she's not a donor figure. And that's why, again, we have to be cautious about interpreting some of these figures automatically. Just because they're kneeling or making this gesture, they might not be. However, there are two more that appear at the bottom that do seem to be, and in both cases they're women, although the one in front, the larger one, has been damaged. They are shown not only offering reverence, but also offering objects, which is typical, objects that would be used in rituals. And this is another aspect that we tend to dismiss. And on the other side of this are the kinds of ritual offerings, probably grain, that would be used either in standard daily worship or in, and especially in, the consecration rituals, the pratishta. And I have a hypothesis that perhaps in cases like this, these are examples, both of them are from Odisha, that I took a long time ago, of below Buddha images, and they have very extensive donor portraits that show a book being held on a stand, the same kind of grain offerings, lamps, incense burners, and a ritual figure, a priestly figure who's holding a bell and a vajra, a ritual implement. And we say the same thing here. Another family, we have a small child along with a number of women behind a man, and then offerings. And so this may actually depict an elaborate ritual having to do with the installation, because again, this was this crucial point in the life of the image when it transitioned from just an object that a sculptor could actually sit on and carve and turn over. And once it's been consecrated, it is treated with a great deal of respect and reverence. You would never, roll it over or do anything like that or touch it in certain ways once it's been consecrated. So this is a critical moment, and I think that, and after all, that is the essence of the gift. That's what the donors are giving, is this opportunity for mute materiality to become filled with Newman. And so it would make sense, at least to me, that is what is going on the donor figures that include ritual implements, is that it's a reminder of that. Now here's the Buddhist Vajratara, another just astounding work of sculpture, the litheness of the body, the way that the jewelry reveals the body underneath. It's certainly idealized, and it has a great deal of detail, but it's loving detail. It's not what is often phrased as horror vacui, or the fear of emptiness, but rather in India there's a value that is finishing, perfecting, elaborating. That's what is being suggested here, and certainly no expense is being spared. And almost unexpectedly, we find at the bottom a whole crew of donors, including this one here, who is bearded and is holding, I think, an incense burner, or possibly a flower. But he, I think, is the ritual master, what's called the Vajracharya or the Acharya, who is performing the ritual. And notice his centrality. It's almost always on the right, but the most important figure there. And then other female donors are being lauded there. I just bring a couple of historical figures or photographs in to remind us of how many amazing sculptures there were from this time, and how they were collected and dispersed all over the world now into museums. This is as you can see from the label, a photograph of the Broadley collection, and many of these are now in the Indian Museum in Calcutta, but not all of them. And he's called the collector of Patna. That didn't mean he was an art collector. It means he was a tax collector. That was the important one. But it allowed him access to all of the surrounding temples and villages, and any object that was not, I think, staked down or in totally, right at the center of the temple, he collected as part of his duties. And so, actually, of course, from our perspective, these photographs are invaluable, because we can sometimes identify, and I looked carefully to see if there's a couple of candidates in here. But it does also, the other thing that's important to see is that at the time, Buddhist and Hindu images were mixed together. And these are not all Buddhist. And so I turn now to some examples of non-Buddhist images, including this wonderful Jain Parshavanatha, the 23rd Tirthankara, or it's kind of the Jain equivalent of the Buddha, from Bangladesh, perhaps the Dhaka district, which is also upstairs. Note especially the snakes, the snake hood. As part of his story, he was protected by cobras, protected from the mischief of a demon, and so the snakes. There's an ambivalent relationship to snakes, both fearing them and respecting them, and seeing them as both positive, but as potentially really dangerous animals, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. And here again we have donor figures shown, as well as another smaller cobra-headed figure known as a naga. So nagas were brought into the fold as if to protect people from them, to offer reverence, but here they're shown as themselves offering reverence to the figures. And we'll find that later on there are some direct reverencing of the nagas. Here they're shown as in a subsidiary role. But then here are a male and female couple, perhaps husband and wife, and the inscription is ambiguous. It just says, "Let Utpala speak in heaven." It seems as if this might be a dedication, that let our relative attain to heaven. And so it's not necessarily we paid for this, but the implication is we paid for this in order that one of our relatives, one of our dearly beloved, can have a favorable rebirth. There's another one on the other side, as well as a ritual object. And now let's look at a few, before we take a break, let's look at a few Hindu images as well. And this is I think it's got that sign on there, one of the 50 most popular objects in the museum, and well deserved. It is quite fabulous. It shows Vishnu in the form of Narasimha, and it shows not only two forms of the evil but powerful Ashura Hiranyakashipu in being destroyed, but also it shows the narrative coming up to that. And he had won boons, I think from Shiva, possibly from Brahma, that he asked that the boon would be that he never dies. And Shiva says, "Well, I can't grant that." He says, "Okay, well, I don't want to die in the day or in the night. I don't want to die by the hands of from a sword, from a weapon of any sort." He's trying to cover his bases, and I don't want to die on earth or in heaven. And so okay, and I don't want to be killed by a god or an animal or a human. Well, that covers it, he thinks. But then he thinks he's more powerful than Vishnu. But his son is a devotee of Vishnu, and so he argues with him philosophically and says, "Oh, come on, where is Vishnu? I can't see him. Is he in this pillar?" And his son dutifully, piously says, "Yes, he's in this pillar even." And he kicks the pillar, and then Narasimha comes out, and it's at twilight, so it's neither the day nor the night. He doesn't use any weapon. He rips him open with his claws, his nails, or his fingers, and he is neither a god nor an animal nor a human, but all of those. So it's a wonderful, memorable story, and the fact that they enjoyed showing that, it tells us where this takes place, because the pedestal is our world, right? The pedestal of these things. It's very clear. This is the divine world, but this is a human world. And so what we have there are activities that happen in our world, with suns and pillars, and then with donors. And so this, by the way, there's a very, very different form of Narasimha. And just this month's Orientations magazine has a very interesting article by John Guy at the Metropolitan on the same topic. But our focus is, of course, the donors here. And here we see another grouping. See another family. On this side are apparently mostly female members. And then one large male, the head of the household, who's being served by someone. And then here's our Purohit. Here's our Brahmin priest. And we know that from not only his position in front of even the head of the household, but also because of this. And what he's holding in his hand, or under his arm there, is a book, right? One of the Vedas, one of the ritual texts, or the Agamas. Just like, and this is a much later Tibetan, but I thought it's so detailed. This is a Tibetan, or an Indian-style book that this Kumara is holding under his arm in the same way. So that's what tells us that he is that he's a priestly figure. We can go on and talk about some of the other amazing. We'll do this one and then we'll take a break. This one is very interesting because it shows the penetration, in a way, of that human realm by a foot. And in India, the feet are the most unclean things, but they're also, the way that you express devotion is to, the most powerful way is to touch your head to your mother or your father or your God's feet. Because they're the lowest, the feet are the lowest thing, and the head is the highest thing. So when they meet, it's a sign of humility and devotion. And so what we see here is, I don't think accidental, that, they didn't have room for her. They could have put her back there, but they wanted to put her in contact with the feet as a way to suggest her devotion. So is this a portrait? It suggests something about the character of the person here. And she is, unidentified, but nonetheless shown as being literally in touch with the deity. All right, let's take a break and come back in how many minutes?